Addis Ababa, and good morning to everyone, depending on where you're connecting, or even good evening from connecting from the different points around the globe. Welcome to this panel, on which will be addressing the questions of a green recovery in Africa, and in particular, implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area. So my name is Jean-Paul Adam, and I am the Director of Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resources at the United Nations Economic Commission here based in Addis Ababa. I'm delighted to welcome everyone today at this online event, which is co-organized under the Supporting Investment and Trade in Africa program by ODI with the African Center for Economic Transformation and the African Trade Policy Center at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa.